And good morning, everyone. I am Shaheen, and welcome to our panel discussion titled Food for People or Food for Landfills under Sustainable Development Goals 13 Climate Action. So, today we will discuss one of the most pressing environmental and social issues in Malaysia, that is, food waste. So, every year, huge amounts of edible food are thrown away, while at the same time, many people still face food insecurity. This issue is not only about hunger or poor planning, it is also closely tied to climate change. So when food is wasted, all the resources used to produce it, such as water, land, labor, fuel, and electricity, are wasted too. On top of that, food waste that ends up in landfills produces methane, which is a greenhouse gas that is far more potent than carbon dioxide. So the key question for today's discussion is this. Who is more responsible for the food waste crisis? Is it consumers through careless daily habits, or is it businesses through overproduction and commercial practices? In other words, should we focus more on changing behavior at home, or on reforming the food system itself? I will be your moderator for today, and my role will be to guide the discussion, challenge both sides fairly, and highlight the key points of disagreement. But before we continue, let me first introduce our four panelists. So our first panelist will be Farah. She will argue that consumer attitudes are the main driver of food waste. Second panelist is Nur Shahidatul, or also known as Chacha. She will continue the case for consumer responsibility. And third panelist, Luzman, he will argue that businesses and industrial overproduction are the bigger cause. And finally, our fourth and final panelist, Azmira, she will focus on corporate accountability and why the commercial food sector deserves a stronger policy attention. Now, with that, let us begin with the consumer side of the debate. The stage is yours, first panelist.
Thank you, Shaheen. It's a pleasure to be here. From my point of view, I strongly believe that consumer attitude are the primary cause of food waste because food waste often happen at the final stage, which is inside the home, where food is either consumed or thrown away. Business may supply food, but they do not force people to buy too much, what is already in their fridge or throw away perfectly edible leftovers. These are choices made by consumer and that is why I believe household should be seen as the main driver of waste. Research by Salome 2026 supports this argument by showing that food waste is often caused by poor management, confusion over expiry dates, and overpurchasing in order to appear as a good provider. This is important because it suggests that waste is not only about supply, but also about mindset. People often buy more food than they need because they associate with abundance of care, hospitality, or good parenting. As a result, food becomes easier to waste because it is treated as something replaceable rather than valuable. I also want to challenge the argument that business are mainly to blame. Yes, business overproduce, but that does not automatically make them the bigger cause. If consumer plan meals properly, store food correctly, and stop throwing away edible foods quickly, a large amount of waste could still be prevented. So even if business improve their system, food waste will remain a serious problem unless consumer attitude change first. That is why I argue that our households are not just part of the problem, they are the most immediate and direct cause of food waste. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Farah. I think you make a strong case that food waste is driven by personal behavior and household attitudes, especially when overbuying and expiry date confusion are involved. But however, I also want to challenge your argument with this question. Can consumers really be called the main cause if they are making choices within a food system that is already shaped by businesses through promotions, oversized portions, and constant pressure to buy more? In other words, are consumers truly creating the problem or are they simply responding to a wasteful environment? All right, let us now hear from our second panelist, that is Chacha, who will continue the argument for consumer responsibility.
Thank you, moderator. I agree with Farah, and I will even argue that consumers need to take more responsibility for food waste. While businesses do play a role in shaping the food environment, I think consumers still make daily choices about what they buy, how much they cook, and whether leftovers are eaten or thrown away. So, households are not just victims of the system, they are active participants in it. According to Bolwick 2021, there are many simple ways consumers can do to reduce food waste, such as planning meals, storing food properly, controlling portion sizes, and reusing leftovers. This is important because it proves that a lot of household food waste can actually be prevented. I also think that focusing too much on businesses can be misleading because it may make consumers feel powerless, as if food waste is entirely someone else's fault. But the reality is that millions of households waste small amounts, sorry, but the reality is that millions of households waste small amounts of food every day. One container of leftovers might not seem like much, but when that happens across an entire country, the impact becomes huge. So yes, businesses contribute to the problem, but consumers still control what happens at the final stage of the food chain. If people continue wasting food at home, then blaming supermarkets and restaurants alone will not solve the issue. That's why I believe households should carry a larger share of responsibility.
Right, thank you, Chacha. Is that all? I take it as yes. I think your point is clear. If household waste is preventable, then consumers cannot avoid responsibility by simply blaming the system. But however, this also raises a difficult issue. Even if consumers waste food daily, are we ignoring the fact that businesses waste food in bulk before food even reaches their households? I mean, a family may waste leftovers, but at the same time, a supermarket can dispose of unsold products by the truckload. So, does the larger scale of commercial waste makes businesses the more serious cause overall? To argue that side, let us now hear from our third panelist, Luzman. You may present.
Thank you, moderator. I respectfully disagree with Farah and Chacha. Consumer may contribute to food waste, but businesses cause bigger problem because they create waste on a much larger and more structural scale. The problem does not begin in the kitchen. It begins much earlier in the food chain, where restaurants, supermarkets, suppliers, and retailers keep overproducing, overstocking, rejecting imperfect produce, and throwing away unsold food simply to maintain appearance, variety, and profit. The Move for Hunger report show that restaurant and grocery store often overorder, reject food based on commercial standard, and waste resources such as water and fuel in the process. This is not small-scale waste caused by poor habits. This is waste good into commercial operation. On top of that, UNEP estimates that 1.05 billion tons of food are waste globally each year, with 90% coming from retail and food service. To me, this proves that the waste is not only matter of careless consumers. It is also a systemic result of how the food industry is designed to function. I also want to push back against the consumer argument, saying that households are the main cause ignore the fact that consumer can only waste the food that businesses choose to put into circulation in the first place. Supermarkets keep shelf overstocked to look abundant. Restaurants prepare excess food to avoid running out. Retailers reject edible produce because it does not look attractive enough to sell. These are not consumer decisions, these are business decisions. So while households do waste food, I will argue that consumer waste is often just the final symptom of much larger commercial system that normalize excess. This is why I believe businesses deserve greater blame, not because consumers are innocent, but because businesses shape the scale, supply, and structure of waste long before it reached the home. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luzman. I see that is a strong challenge to the consumer argument. I get it. You are essentially saying that households may waste food, but businesses create the conditions that makes large-scale waste possible in the first place. Still, I want to press you on one point. If businesses overproduce because consumers expect full shelves, large portions, and endless variety, can businesses really be blamed more than the demand that drives them? If consumers stop rewarding excess, would businesses still behave the same way? Let us now hear from our final panelist, Azmira, who will expand on why the commercial sector should be held accountable. You may go ahead.
Thank you. I agree with Lukman's point that businesses play a major role in creating food waste, but I would like to also focus specifically on accountability. At the same time, I acknowledge Farah and Nur Shahidatul argument that the consumer also contribute to the problem through everyday habits. However, in my view, is that responsibility should be proportional to influence. Since businesses have greater control over production levels, supply chains, food distribution, proportion sizes, marketing strategy, and food standard, they should also be held to higher standard of accountability for reducing waste. This argument is supported by United Nations Environment Programme in 2026, which show that businesses can reduce food waste through monitoring, reporting, and operational improvement. A strong example is Hilton Green Ramadan Initiative, which cut plate waste by 26% through staff training and menu redesign. What made this example particularly significant is that the reduction was achieved without reducing customer service quality. This suggests that food waste is often the result of inefficient system rather than unavoidable business need. When companies actively measure and manage waste, meaningful improvement can be achieved without sacrificing profitability and customer satisfaction. I also want to challenge the idea that customers should receive the same level of blame. Of course, household waste food, but they do not have the same power as businesses to shape the entire food system. A family can reduce leftover at home, but it cannot stop supermarkets from rejecting edible produce or prevent hotels from preparing excessive buffet quantity. Businesses can influence waste upstream before it reaches household overall. This is why I believe policy attention should focus more heavily on commercial sector. Government should require company to report food waste level, establish reduction target, and strengthen regulation to ensure greater corporate accountability throughout the food supply chain. If actors with greater power are not held accountable, then expecting the household alone to solve the food waste crisis is both unfair and unrealistic. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Asmira. I see that your argument shifts the debate from individual habits to a structural power. But this also raises an important policy question. If businesses can reduce waste through monitoring and better practices, should change be encouraged voluntarily through campaigns and incentives, or should governments impose stronger regulation and penalties? I think that is the perfect question to take into our Q&A session. So, thank you, panelists, for your presentation. We will move on to our next segment, that is Q&A session. So, I would like to begin our session by asking and allowing Farah and Chacha to answer my question. Luzman argues that businesses create waste on a systemic scale before food even reaches consumers, while Azmira says businesses deserve more blame because they have greater power over the food system. So my question to both of you is this. Can consumer education and household behavior really balance the scale of waste created by businesses, or are you placing too much responsibility on individuals? That is all from me.
I understand that business waste food on a larger scale, and I do agree that commercial practice need reform. However, I still do not think that removes responsibility from consumer is a good idea. My problem with the business argument is that it can make household waste sound less important simply because it happens in smaller amounts. But to be fair, smaller amounts repeated by millions of our households are not small anymore. If people continue overbuying, misunderstanding expiry dates, and wasting leftovers, then food waste will remain high no matter how efficient supermarkets and restaurants becomes. So, to answer your question, I would say consumer education alone may not solve the whole problem, but it is still essential because it targets the final point where food is either used or waste. Business may shape the environment, but households still decide what happens to the food once it enters the house. That is why I believe consumer behavior should not be treated as secondary.
Thank you, Farah. Chacha, do you have any say in this?
Honestly, I partially agree with Lusman and Asmira points that businesses contribute to food waste before food even reaches consumers. This is because I think the role of consumers is sometimes underestimated. The, reas- the reason is that household household food waste is often the easiest type of waste to prevent. Businesses may end up wasting food because they have to deal with uncertain demand, supply chain problems, or the need to keep shelves stocked. In contrast, food waste at home often happens because of everyday habits such as buying more food than needed, cooking too much, or forgetting to eat leftovers. So, while I agree that businesses reform is important, I do not think that it is fair to say that consumers are simply victims of the system. Consumers still have control over many of their daily food-related decisions. For example, families can reduce food waste by planning their meals, storing food properly, and serving more suitable portion size. These are simple actions, but they can make a significant difference. If more households adopted these habits, a large amount of food waste could be prevented, right? For that reason, I do not see consumer education as a distraction from the issue. Instead, I see it as one of the most practical and immediate ways to tackle food waste while broader changes in the food industry are taking places.
Okay, thank you very much to Farah and Chacha for the answer. Now, Luzman, I would like to ask you a question. So Farah and Chacha argue that even if businesses overproduce, households still make the final decision to waste food. So let me challenge you directly. If consumers stop overbuying and became more careful with food, wouldn't businesses eventually be forced to reduce supply as well? Doesn't that mean consumer behavior still drives the system?
I agree that consumer behavior influence demand, but I think that argument give consumer more power than they actually have. But we can see in reality, businesses do not simply respond to their demand. They also shape it. Supermarket use promotion like buy more, save more. Restaurant serve oversized portion, and retailers maintaining full shelf to create the impression of abundance. These strategies encourage some consumer to purchase and waste more money than they otherwise would. So yes, consumers should improve their habit. But I still believe that root of the problem lies with businesses because they create the condition that normalize access in the first place. If if we only tell consumer to be more careful without addressing overproduction, cosmetic standard and wasteful retail practices, then we are treating the symptom rather than cause. That is why I still argue that commercial food waste deserves stronger policy intervention than household waste.
Okay, thank you very much, Luzman. Um, Next, Azmira, I would also like to ask you a question. So Luzman argues for stronger policy intervention, and your own point focus on corporate accountability. So let me ask you this: should businesses be pushed mainly through strict regulation, or do you think voluntary campaigns and awareness programs can still be effective as well?
believe regulation is necessary, but I do not think regulation alone is enough. If food waste has serious environmental consequence, then businesses should be required to monitor and reduce it rather than treating waste reduction as optional. Without enforcement, many companies may continue wasteful practices because overproduction is often more convenient or profitable than reforming their operational. At the same time, awareness campaigns, incentive, and staff training are also important because they help create long-term change within organizations. The Houston example show that when businesses actively redesign their operation, waste can be reduced in measurable ways. Furthermore, mandatory food waste reporting Mandatory food waste reporting would increase transparency and allow government and the public to evaluate it whether the business are genuinely reducing waste or simply making promises without measurable results. So, my position is that regulation should provide pressure, while awareness and operational support should provide the pathway for change. However, if I had to choose which is more important, I would still prioritize regulation because accountability should not depend entirely on whether a company feels morally motivated to act. Thank you.
Thank you, Azmira, for the clear answer. All right. Thank you to all of our panelists for a thoughtful and lively discussion. So I would like to conclude what today's panel has shown is that food waste is not a simple issue with a single cause. Farah and Chacha argue that consumers deserve major responsibility because household food waste is driven by poor planning, expiry date confusion, overbuying, and the failure to manage leftovers responsibly. The argument is that even if businesses improve, waste will continue unless customer attitudes and habits change at home. On the other hand, Luzman and Azmira argued that businesses deserve much greater blame because they themselves create waste on a larger and more structural scale through overproduction, strict cosmetic standards, oversized portions, and also inefficient commercial practices. Their position is that consumers may waste food at the end of the chain, but businesses themselves that shape the change itself, and therefore hold more power, more influence, and greater responsibility. So the real disagreement today is not whether both sides contribute to food waste. Clearly they do, but the deeper debate is which level of the problem deserves greater policy attention. Is it the household behavior or is it the commercial system that produces food in excess? If we can take one message from today's discussion is it is this food waste under SDG 13 is both a behavioral issue and also a structural issue. Consumers must learn to value food more responsibly, but businesses and policymakers must also be held accountable for creating a system where waste is normalized. Only when both sides are addressed together can food truly go to people instead of landfills. Thank you for listening to our panel discussion.